Samuel 13 is where we are. And just by means of kind of catching us up a little bit, um, over the last couple of chapters, we've seen as the Israelites were going to war, David stayed behind, and of course there was this um, the affair with Bathsheba and all that took place with the murder of her husband Uriah, and then of course the punishment that God brought down upon David. Whereas he said, God gave David grace in that he spared his life, but he did tell David the sword's not going to leave your family. Now, when we talk about that, he's not necessarily saying there's going to be, continued wars for Israel. He's being very specific, the house of David. And so what we see here in 2 Samuel 13 is the beginning of that. Certainly not the end of it. But 2 Samuel 13, this is a dark, dark chapter. And it is what we might refer to as a very adult chapter with content. But it is important to understand not only the roots of it, but to understand where it's leading us. Okay, and so with all that in mind, we won't read through the whole thing right now. It's a longer chapter, but let's read through a little bit here. 2 Samuel 13, verse 1. And it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, and Jonadab was a very subtle man. And he said unto him, Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? Wilt thou not tell me? And Amnon said unto him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. And Jonadab said unto him, Lay thee down on thy bed, and make thyself sick. And when thy father cometh to thee, say unto him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come, and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it and eat it at her hand. And so Amnon lay down, and he made himself sick. And when the king was come to see him, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come, and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I might eat at her hand. And then David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house, and dress him meat. And so Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laid down. And she took flour and kneaded it and made the cakes in his sight and did bake the cakes. And she took a pan and poured them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have out all the men from me. And they all went out, every man from him. And Amnon said unto Tamar, Bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her, and he said unto her, Come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her, and lay with her. And then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. And she said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other that thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. And then he called his servant that ministered unto him, and said, Put now this woman out from me, and bolt the door after her. And when she had a garment of divers colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. And then his servant brought her out, and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. And Absalom her brother said unto her, Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother. Regard not this thing. And so Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. And we'll stop right there just for a moment. And so, as I said, back in the last chapter, David was told that the sword would never depart from his house. And so with chapter 13, as I said a while ago, we see only the beginning of the tragedies that would befall the house of David. And obviously you could take this back even farther, because David lost the son that was the result of that relationship with Bathsheba. And so he had already lost one son, and so now we come to this particular story with Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom. Now Amnon is David's firstborn son. a lot of this we get from the genealogical portions of First Chronicles. Amnon was David's firstborn son, and I put this in quotes, not only because it's a quotation, but because we understand it's not true love. But Amnon loved, quote unquote, his half-sister Tamar. Now Tamar and Absalom, they were full siblings. They were children of a woman, Maacah. Amnon was the son of the woman Ahinoam. And so we know that Amnon and Tamar were only half siblings, obviously same father, different mothers. But he had this sick, twisted obsession with his half-sister Tamar. And so he became obsessed with her. Now, here's the thing. We have to understand this chapter in light of what has happened with David. Because there are parallels. Not to say that the exact things are happening, but parallels. And so Amnon became obsessed with Tamar, and so like his father, he wanted what he could not have. So Amnon here was obsessing over Tamar. David was obsessing over Bathsheba, right? So similar circumstances, different outcome, similar circumstances. So obviously the sin of Amnon goes much farther than that of the sin of David, but it undoubtedly had its roots in the sin of David. And so when Nathan tells David the sword will not depart, David, in this episode here, had to have the understanding that this was kind of the falling out of his particular sin with Bathsheba. Now, Amnon's cousin here, Jonadab, and he's going to pop up again at the end of this chapter. Jonadab, he's described as a very subtle man. And that's a dangerous thing, and we'll talk about that more at the end. But Jonadab here is a very subtle man, and he devises a plan to make Amnon's desire come to pass. And so he's talking to Amnon. He sees, hey, you don't seem to be yourself. Right, nothing's normal about you, and so Amnon confesses this sick perversion that he has, and so Jonadab, instead of being wise counsel, again, he's a subtle man. He's not necessarily a moral man, right? And so he says, well, if that's what you want, I know how to make that happen, right? And so he has worldly wisdom, one might say, and so he comes up with this plan. It says essentially all you need to do is you need to just fake like you're very, very sick, almost on your deathbed. And you need to talk to David and say, I need Tamar to come and prepare food. I'm so sick I can't even eat. I can't even prepare my food. Have her prepare it. She can feed me. This will help me gain my strength. And so David obviously has no idea what he's actually planning. And again, this might seem strange to us, but culturally speaking, there wouldn't have been anything really out of the ordinary for his sister to come in and do this. And so this was, again, as far as David is concerned, there's nothing out of the ordinary taking place here. And so he does. He sends Tamar. Now she comes over to his house, and she does everything that is asked of her. We see that. She bakes the cake. She does all this. She prepares the food. Eventually, Amnon sends everyone out of the room, and he asks her to feed him by hand. Now again, even at this point, she may have suspected that something was off. Sending everybody out of the room wasn't necessarily a normal thing to do. But at the end of the day, I feel, again, this is my opinion, it would be unlikely at this particular point for her to know what he is planning. Again, in her mind, Amnon is possibly on his deathbed. He's so sick, right? If his actions seem a little out of the ordinary, there's a good explanation for that. He's not thinking clearly. And so he's so sick. He's so weak. He can't make food. He can't feed himself. And so at this particular point, she's just trying to help her brother. And so she does this. She comes to him, and she starts feeding him. And it is at this point that the text tells us Amnon took hold of her, and he said unto her, come lie with me, my sister. And he even calls her my sister. Right? And so we understand the depravity of Amnon's mind here. Now, the Bible is making no attempts to hide the depravity of the story. It's not trying to wrap this in some kind of gilded lining. It tells us what happened. It gives us the details accurately. It's not trying to uplift or downplay anything. It just gives it as it is. And now, as always, it does it without being overtly graphic. Right? It doesn't give us every minute detail. It doesn't need to. It just needs to let us know what happened, and that's exactly what it does. And so Tamar, again, the scene is such a sad one. She's pleading with her brother. And she says, nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And so ultimately, in the course of her conversation here, she uses three different arguments. The first of all being, it's unlawful. And I like the fact that the first thing that Tamar turns to and this kind of speaks to the kind of woman that she was. The first thing Tamar turns to is not just fear or anything like that. The first thing she turns to is, this is not lawful, right? And she's not talking about the law of the land. What she's talking about is, this is not lawful according to God. This is against our law as the Mosaic code. This is not lawful. And of course, she's right. It is clearly prohibited in the Mosaic law. There's a couple of different portions of Scripture there. One of them relating to, being with your sister. Deuteronomy portion specifically dealing with the topic of rape. And so both of these things, there's no aspect of this that was okay within the moral code of God. And so she turns, first of all, saying, Amnon, this is morally wrong. There's nothing about what you're trying to do that could be justified in any sense. And second of all, it would shame her. Now, unfortunately, in our particular society, shame doesn't mean much anymore. People do things that even 50 years ago would have been considered so shameful, it never would have been brought to the light of day, and now these things are worshipped. And so shame has taken kind of a back seat. But shame was a very, very big thing, culturally speaking, and in particular Eastern cultures, even still today. Shame is a very big thing. And so this would cause a great deal of shame to come upon Tamar. She says, whither will I cause my shame to go? Right? There's no coming back from this. And then thirdly, it would cause Amnon to become as one of the fools in Israel. Now the word fool, when we hear the word fool, we think of somebody just doing something kind of foolish. Maybe they thought something foolish, or they did something, kind of, silly, or, outside of the lines of normalcy. But biblically speaking, a fool is not just someone who does something foolish. A fool is someone who does something ungodly. A fool is somebody doing things that are immoral, ungodly, wicked acts. In Isaiah 32, the same Hebrew word is translated vile person. Isaiah 32:6, for the vile person, that could literally say the fool. For the vile person will speak villainy, and his heart will work iniquity. That's really a good biblical definition of a fool. And so when she says, don't do this foolish thing, she's not saying, don't do this silly thing. No, don't do this ungodly, wicked act. Psalm 74:22 says, arise, O God, plead thine own cause. Remember how the foolish man hath reproached thee daily. Okay, and so she's again, I say this because I want to bring out Tamar's character here. In two or her three arguments, she brings it back to God, right? Essentially, God says, don't do this. And if you do this, you're going against God. Now, that should have been an argument that would work. It should have worked. But Amnon at this point, again, he was so obsessed, so vile in his thinking towards Tamar that it didn't matter what she said. Honestly, at this point, it didn't matter. He had the upper hand. He had the everything was working towards him being able to do this. So it didn't matter what she did or said. This was going to happen. And so she pleads for him to just wait. And she tells him, here's what she tells him. She says, just wait. Talk to David. If you really want me, talk to David. David will give me to you. Now, a lot of people have taken this verse and have run with it and have created, I read a lot in the Mishnahs and the rabbinical writings about this, and they have created entire backstories for Amnon and Tamar and given genealogical histories to make it so that, well, what she said was technically okay because down the line there were certain relationships and maybe she wasn't really the full daughter of David, and so maybe if they got married, it wouldn't really be breaking the... They try to create all of these problems instead of just saying, this woman is about to be raped. She's throwing everything at the wall to see if something sticks, right, to not get raped. I don't know how else to say it. I'm not trying to be overtly graphic, but she's in a desperate situation. She knows what's about to happen. She's not thinking about the genealogical intricacies of what would happen if they got married. No, she's trying to do everything she can to keep this man away from her. And so, I don't think we need to make anything more of it than what it is. And so this is just the desperate pleas of Tamar. But the text, unfortunately, doesn't end there. It says, howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. Now again, the Bible leaves us no question as to what happened. There is no doubt that Amnon raped Tamar. There's no question about this. And the reason why I say that so strongly is because if you remember back a couple of chapters ago, there are all kinds of questions about David and Bathsheba. What was the exact nature of that particular encounter? Not everybody knows this was an adulterous affair. We understand that. But, and I mentioned, it comes up all the time, did David rape Bathsheba? And I told you back then, the text doesn't seem to indicate that it rose to that level. And I think here is a particular proof that it didn't rise to that level, because the Bible tells us when rape happens. The Bible is undeniably and unquestionably clear. And if it wasn't undeniably and unquestionably clear with David and Bathsheba, that should lead us to understand that adulterous affair it wasn't a rape. And I would stand on that quite firmly. I don't think it would be rape in the case of David and Bathsheba. Unquestionably, it is here. And so, as disgusting as this is, as terrible as this is, you see again the false notion of quote-unquote love that Amnon had before, because you see in verse 15, then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he loved her. And so essentially verse 15 is there to show us that this was not love. Amnon didn't love Tamar. Amnon lusted after Tamar. And those are not the same thing at all. And so this is, love does not act in this way, right? And I've talked about it in the past. Love is not an emotion, right? Love is an action. I can't be commanded to emote in a particular way, right? If somebody comes in and commands me, be sad right now, right? I can feign sadness, but I can't command myself to actually be sad. But the Bible consistently over and over commands us to love, right? It's not commanding emotion, it's commanding actions. And so Amnon did not love Tamar. Amnon lusted after Tamar, and it's clear that that's what's happening here. And so he now hates her, and this is kind of prototypical behavior with rapists, right? They have this lustful perversion after a particular person, particularly if it's someone who they've been thinking about, and it's not kind of a spur-of-the-moment thing, you know. If this is somebody they've been thinking about after the deed is done, this is often the reaction. They hate them. They want to get as far away from that person. Now, what's happening is not necessarily that they hate that person. They hate what they've done. And the hatred that they're really feeling is with their own sin, right? And so that's what's taking place here. And Amnon is disgusted, even if he doesn't understand it, with himself. And so he puts her away, because to look at the face of Tamar is to remind him of what he's just done to his sister. And so he has her put away. And again, she protests, but he's through with her. Now notice this. Back in verse 11, at the end of verse 11, he says unto her, come lie with me, my sister. And, we understand the perversion of thinking that. But then he still refers to her as my sister. But then look at verse 15, at the end of verse 15. And Amnon said unto her, arise, be gone. He won't use her name. He won't even call her sister. You're nothing to me now. Just leave. I got what I wanted. And so even with their protestations, again, he sends her out. Not only sends her out, but calls the servants in to shut and lock the door behind her. Right? This is the absolute vilest behavior. And then we see Tamar here begins to mourn. Obviously, this is the natural reaction here. She begins to mourn for what has been done to her. She puts ashes on her head. She tears her ceremonial garments, and these garments were symbolizing her virginity. Obviously, this is not applicable anymore, right, to no fault of her own. But she rips apart these garments, puts ashes on her head. She goes to live with Absalom. Absalom is her full brother, and Absalom, comforts her while secretly plotting revenge. And I think the text is clear. I don't think Tamar had any idea that Absalom was planning this. Maybe she did, but I don't think the text lends itself to that. And so Absalom here is this secretly plotting revenge. Now, again, Amnon, like his father, wanted what he couldn't have. Absalom, like his father, sought to kill the problem. Right? I mean, so again, we see the roots of David's sin. Even though both of these men took things farther than what David did, we see the roots of David's sin in the actions of both of his sons here. And so for a couple of years here, Absalom waited and he plotted, and he doesn't talk to Absalom the whole time. And of course, that makes sense. And so we see that the scene very quickly switches to David, and we just get a couple of verses of David's perspective on this. So verse 21, when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. Now that's a good reaction. You should be. But then verse 22, we kind of have to take a step back and understand. And Absalom spoke unto his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. And so verse 21, David is wroth. Verse 22, what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. David's angry, but ultimately does nothing. David is angry, and he's very wroth. He hates the situation, but cares not enough about justice to do anything about it. Now, again, think about this from Tamar's perspective, because I want to come back to her for a second. I think from everything we get here, and I get it's brief, but I think from everything we see from Tamar, I think she was a godly woman. A young woman, but I think she was a godly woman. Again, 2 out of her 3 arguments appealed to what does God want in this situation, even in the midst of what was a chaotic mess. And so David here does not really care for the justice of Tamar. And so people have questioned why. He should have been sorrowfully seeking the consequences of the sin of Amnon. But notably, there is no punishment. Now, I can't say that this is why, but Amnon is the firstborn. He is the heir to be king. And so David, again, from an Eastern perspective, understands that in a normal line of succession, Amnon would be the next king. And as far as David is concerned right now, he has no idea that God's line was not going to go through Amnon. It was going to go through Solomon. But David doesn't know that. And so David understands right now, just kind of a cultural perspective, Amnon's going to be king one day. And so whereas he's angry, whereas he's sorrowful that this particular situation happened, at the end of the day, he doesn't do anything. Even though the biblical commandment, you can go back to that Deuteronomy passage that I noted earlier, the biblical commandment was that Amnon be killed. Amnon should have been brought to justice for this unquestionably evil action, but he wasn't. And so one thing we'll see, and this is kind of consistent with David, is that when it comes to his family, he oftentimes overlooks. And this isn't just David. This happens with families all the time, is that we're very quick to condemn when it's outside of our own household, right? And so we're very quick to overlook things that happen in our own house. And so this is very true with David. We see it here with Amnon. We'll see it later with Absalom. We'll see it consistently that David just kind of refuses to punish his children, even though sometimes that justice was called for. And so he doesn't do anything. And really, with regards to Amnon, that's all we see. The only picture of David we see is he was mad, but ultimately didn't do anything about it. And so not a very good look, obviously, when it comes to David. Well, let's pick it up. We didn't read this earlier, so pick it up at verse 23. And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is beside Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king, and he said, Behold, now thy servant hath sheep shearers. Let the king, I beseech thee, and his servants go with thy servant. And the king said unto Absalom, Nay, my son, let us not all go, lest we be chargeable unto thee. And he pressed him, howbeit he would not go, but blessed him. And then said Absalom, If not, I pray thee, let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said unto him, Why should he go with thee? But Absalom pressed him, that he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, Mark you now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say unto you, Smite Amnon, then kill him. Fear not, have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. And the servants of Absalom did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. And then all the king's sons arose, and every man got him up on his mule and fled. And it came to pass while they were in the way that tidings came to David, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. And then the king arose and tare his garments and lay on the earth. And all the servants stood by with their clothes rent. And Jonadab, here he is again, and Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered, and he said, Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon only is dead. But Absalom fled, and the young men that kept the watch lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hillside beyond him. And Jonadab said unto the king, Behold, the king's sons come, as thy servant said, so it is. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking, that behold, the king's sons came, and lifted up their voice and wept, and the king also, and all the servants wept very sore. But Absalom fled, and he went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. And so Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. And so for 2 years, Tamar is staying with Absalom, and I think the understanding is that she was probably with him this whole time. And so for 2 years, Absalom is, I keep saying Absalom, Absalom is plotting and revenging, plotting a revenge against his brother. Now, this is a tricky situation because from a human level, just on a deep base human nature, we understand this. From a deep level of humanity, we understand why Absalom is mad. We can understand why he would plot to kill his brother. We can understand why he does these things. But we also understand there's a biblical command against these things, right? We are not to take revenge. This wasn't the self-defense in the moment, and the Bible is not against you defending yourself. But the Bible is against you taking 2 years to plot the death of another human being. And so this is not in any sense within the realm of morality. And so this is a sinful action by Absalom. And so for 2 years, he plots and he finally sees his opportunity. And so essentially, he has some sheep that needs to be sheared. And so he decides basically to invite the king and all of his brothers over to basically have a sheep shearing party. Right? We're just going to come. We're going to shear some sheep. We're going to have a feast. It'll be a great time. And so he calls to David, says, "Let everybody come over." Now, David ultimately declines, citing it's too much. It's too much for you to host all of us. I don't want to put that burden upon you, basically. But then Absalom pleads with David, "Let Amnon come." Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. I'm putting this in the lesson, but we don't get all the details here. But it seems as if either one of two things happen. Perhaps David has been kind of laying a protective hand on Amnon from Absalom for these 2 years. Because Absalom has to plead with David to allow Amnon to come. Now, these are adult men, right? Absalom is staying in his own home, right? There shouldn't be any reason why Absalom would have to go through David to get Amnon to come. But I think it's likely that David has kind of been protecting Amnon for these 2 years. Or it could be that David was just really curious as to why are you pushing so hard for Amnon to come. Maybe David slightly suspected something was happening, but even if he did, I don't think he ever thought it was going to go to this degree. So nevertheless, there's pleading, there's this questioning, and then finally it was agreed Amnon would come. Along with his other brothers, but of course the emphasis is here upon Amnon. And so Absalom had talked to his servants beforehand. He says, things are going to take place. Wine is going to be flowing. As soon as I think that Amnon is to the point where he is inebriated enough to really not understand what's going on, I'll give the signal. You guys jump up and you kill Amnon. Now, I think it's notable that here Absalom wanted the deed done, but was not willing to do it himself. He understands that this is wrong. He knows that this is wrong. He knows that, and we can tell by his words to his servants, because he tells them, "You're going to kill him," and then he tells them, he says, "Fear not, have not I commanded you? Be courageous, be valiant." Right? And so as soon as he tells them, he basically has to give them this little pep speech, right, to tell them, it's okay, you can do this. Well, his plan goes swimmingly for him. It goes exactly like he thought. Amnon gets drunk. He gives the signal. The servants kill him. And eventually word gets back to David that all his sons had died. David is understandably distraught. But then here old Jonadab pops back into the scene. Now remember, he's described as subtle. And so he's described as somebody who is wise. And like I said, kind of wise in the ways of the world. And so Jonadab comes to David, who is not only his king but his uncle. We understand that. And so Jonadab comes to David and he tells him, "Listen, don't worry. It's not all your children. It's just Amnon." And so, you don't have to be this distraught. Now Jonadab is the consummate politician. Let's put a positive spin on everything. Let's make everything turn out for our own benefit. And that's exactly what he's doing. Now, and we've seen this twice in this chapter. What does he do with Amnon? Don't for a second try to get Amnon to not do what he wants, even though he knows it's wrong. No, I'm going to work my way into the situation so that he gets what he wants. Because if the king's son gets what he wants, and he understands that I'm the one who helped him, that's a boost for me. Well, same thing here with David. Hey, Jonadab doesn't care who lives or who dies, but he knows if I can comfort the king in this situation, maybe down the line the king remembers that and he helps me a little bit. Maybe gives me a position. Maybe I get some more power out of this. Jonadab, like I said, he is wise, but like I said earlier, he has no principle. And so a wise person with no principle is a dangerous combination. They will get things done, but the things that they get done typically are not things that we would consider to be moral things. And again, what does that describe almost perfectly? Every politician you've ever known. And so Jonadab is the consummate politician. Now, he's right. Again, I never said he was a liar. He's right. And so he comes in and he tells them, it's not all your sons. Well, eventually his sons return. And it says they lifted up their voice and they wept. The king also and his servants, all of them are weeping about this. This is not yes, justice had been done to a degree, but justice not done in the right way. Amnon did deserve to die for what he had done, but he deserved to die in the right manner, proper justice, not by vengeance on behalf of his brother. So everyone understands this is a time for mourning. Mourning the loss of a son and a brother. Mourning the loss of the innocence of a daughter and a sister. Mourning the iniquity that has been brought against the house of David, and more importantly, against the name of God. All of these things were right for mourning. Now, all of his sons returned except Absalom. And Absalom had fled to Talmai, the king of Geshur. Now, again, 2 Samuel, we understand, or back in chapter 3, we understand that Talmai was actually his maternal grandfather. And so he's not just, fleeing to some random place. There's a reason why he goes here. And so Absalom goes, he's living with his grandfather, and for 3 years he stays there. And for 3 years, David mourns for Amnon. However, eventually, grief for Amnon turned to longing for Absalom. And it says at the end of the chapter, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Now, let me just say this. There is a debate. I guess I'll put it this way. There's a lot of debate over exactly what is meant by longing. Because you see here in verse 39, the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom. And then, just to look ahead a little bit, chapter 14, verse 1, it says, now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom. And so we'll see in the next chapter that David has to be convinced, we'll just put it that way, David has to be convinced to go to Geshur and bring Absalom back. And so the question is, if David actually was longing for him in the sense of, I just miss my son, I want to be with him, I want to see him, I want to show my love to him, if that is what is meant by longing, it is seemingly unlikely that David, for, 3 years, 3 years, that David wouldn't have already brought him back. And then in chapter 14 would have to be convinced to bring him back. And so when his heart is longing for Absalom, it could mean that. It could mean the typical, what we think of as longing. It could also mean a longing for justice. His heart was longing for Absalom to see justice be done. Again, I think it's more likely that it's the typical longing that we might think of with that word, simply because of David's inconsistency in bringing justice against his own children. That's just not what David does. And so we've seen that already. We'll continue to see it, even with Absalom. And so the longing here, I think it's best to understand it as it would be most likely to be understood in the sense of longing. And so whatever the case is, David he had been grieving for Amnon, and now his thoughts have kind of turned from Amnon to Absalom, one way or the other. Now, as we close, I mentioned earlier, this is a dark chapter. And as I was thinking through this chapter is inescapably ugly. There's the only good thing that we have seen in the entire chapter was the pleas for God's law by a woman about to be raped. That's the only good thing we've seen in the entire chapter. Obviously, the actions of Amnon and Absalom are both despicable, and even when it comes to David, he refuses to enact justice, right? And so there's really nothing good to turn to in 2 Samuel chapter 13. And so I'll close by this because I found this quote, and I thought it summed this up well. Within that ugliness resides the sovereignty of God. And I want to quote Dale Ralph Davis here because I think he explains this well. So he says, in this sordid episode, then Yahweh is fulfilling his word of judgment against the house of David. Humanly speaking, everything seems to be going awry. And yet Yahweh is fulfilling his word. Not that it is pleasant, anything but. Yet Yahweh has not hung out a vacancy sign over his universe or his people. He is there bringing his word to pass. Sometimes only that assurance keeps his people sane. And so we read through the actions of chapter 13 and we think, Lord, what are we supposed to do with this? I've mentioned this all the time. The Old Testament and really all of the Bible was not necessarily written to us, but it was all written for us. Right? There are truths to be seen. There are lessons to be learned. There are examples to be followed sometimes, obviously not in chapter 13. But when we read through every verse, every chapter is trying to tell us something. Right? There is a reason why this is here. And so we read through chapter 13, and if you're anything like me, you get to the end of the chapter and think, well, what's that lesson? What is that example? I mean, there's obvious examples, don't go rape and murder. But, I don't think we need to understand, those are clear lessons that I don't think we have to really have re-upped over and over and over again. So there must be something greater than that. Well, let's not miss the forest for the trees, because what just happened in the previous chapter? God promised David something. God promised David, the sword is not going to depart from your house. And then what do we see? Not that long after, we see tragedy, and this, like I said, this is the first of several to come. Tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And it all has, as I try to bring out in this chapter, it all has its roots in what David did. Not to say that David is the ultimate one responsible. Amnon is responsible for his sin. Absalom is responsible for his sin. Right? They can't just say, well, look what David did. We did it. It's like, Adam in the garden. No, it's the woman that you gave me, right? He tried to blame it on Eve and God. No, you're responsible for your sin. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your sin happened in a vacuum. That doesn't mean that there's no underlying reasons that led you to that sin. Now, you made the choice. You did the action. You fell in that particular area. Amnon chose to rape his sister. Absalom chose to kill his brother. But where did they get the influence for that? What maybe led them to the conclusions is that something that they could or even should do? Well, look at what David did. Look at what their father had done. And so, again, there are lessons to learn here that, and I said this over and over before, our sins have natural consequences. Just because our sins are forgiven doesn't mean that the penalty for those sins are the natural penalty. Let's put it that way. The natural penalty for their sins is done away with. The eternal penalty is. I don't have to face eternal judgment for my sin, but my sin carries natural punishments here in this world. And so like a loving father, Hebrews tells us, like a loving father, God punishes to bring us to what we need to be. Again, like we always try to do, give the example of a father to a child. It would be the most loving thing I can do for my children is to punish them when they do wrong, when they need it, not unnecessarily. But when they do wrong, the most loving thing I can do for my kids is to punish them. Does that mean I've stopped loving them? No. Does that mean that I won't forgive them? Absolutely not. But that means that that's the best way for them to learn not to do that in the future. And so there are lessons to be seen here. There are deep theological truths to be seen here. And we don't want to miss the sovereignty of God because he's bringing to pass promises that he made. We don't want to miss the sovereignty of God in the messiness of the situation. Was it messy? Yes. Was it brutal? Absolutely. But God is still on his throne. He didn't throw up his hands and say, well, I don't know what to do with this situation. No, God is still sovereign over all. And so, yeah, dark, messy, ugly chapter. But there are still wonderful theological truths to be seen even in the midst of it. So an important chapter, and really it's setting up some things to come with Absalom and David. So important for us to have this foundation here.